The Prime Minister Scott Morrison has had his first meeting with US President Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson on the side of the G7 summit in Cornwall. The trio discussed the Indo-Pacific security threat posed by China, with Mr Morrison backing Joe Biden's calls to bolster efforts to identify the origins of COVID-19. The G7 leaders also committed to funding infrastructure projects to counter Beijing's growing influence on developing nations. The Prime Minister and the British leader also discussed their pending free trade deal, although no agreement has been reached.
We're going to go live now to Cornwall, where our London Bureau Chief Samantha Hawley joins us. Now, as we understand it, the Prime Minister has, of course, had this trilateral meeting with Boris Johnson and Joe Biden. Samantha, what dominated the discussions?
Well, first of all, I think it was rather unusual that a trilateral meeting would occur. We were led to believe that it would be a bilateral meeting, of course, between Scott Morrison and the US leader. That would have been their first meeting. But as it turned out, it became a trilateral meeting. We're not quite sure the reason for that, but nevertheless that meeting went ahead a short time ago. Indo-Pacific security, I think, was a main topic for discussion among those leaders, particularly, of course, the growing power of China and what nations here at the G7 summit in Cornwall can do to counter that. Now, Scott Morrison has spoken today to the G7 leaders during one of the sessions here about his desire, I think, to have a second independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. That is something that Joe Biden has also called for, a swift and thorough investigation. Of course, there has already been one. And also, of course, Scott Morrison has called for a more independent WHO. Let's hear from Scott Morrison and what he had to say after that rather unusual trilateral meeting.
What's important in the future is that should there ever be an event, should there ever be a seriously communicable virus or disease, that the world acts swiftly. I mean, I thought the 100-day plan that was set out today was brilliant. And the leadership of the UK Chief Science Officer, I think it was, who played such a strong role in pulling this together, that's tremendous. But if we can act even earlier, and if the WHO can have the authorities that require that, then I think that's very positive.
Samantha, earlier on you mentioned the growing power of China. Was that something that Scott Morrison also addressed?
Well, yes, and it has been quite a dominant item for discussion here by the G7 leaders. They have committed today to boost funding for infrastructure projects in developing nations to counter Beijing in those nations. Now, of course, China has been pumping money into nations across Asia, across Latin America, for instance, in parts of Europe for many years, boosting infrastructure and embedding their power in those nations. Now, these European leaders have said they need to counter that. They need to be pumping their own money into these countries to build infrastructure and to have more of an influence there and to counter what Beijing is doing. The problem with all of that discussion today, though, was there was no commitment for the funding, so we don't know exactly where all of the money would come from for that. But certainly front and centre at this summit, aside, of course, from the pandemic, which is a huge issue that the leaders here are dealing with, is the rise of China, is the security threat that China is posing not only in the Indo-Pacific but around the world. And so it has been front and centre and of course also for Scott Morrison. And that meeting, even though it was trilateral, even though Boris Johnson was also in the room, is very important, of course, because that's the first meeting we've seen between Scott Morrison and the US leader. And that's really about resetting the relationship, the alliance, after the rather turbulent Trump years.
Well, now that this relationship has been reset, it has been established, Australia, of course, is a guest at the G7 summit. What else is next now for Scott Morrison?
Well, there is another day of events. He was welcomed actually at the summit here on a beach behind me with an elbow bump from Boris Johnson and his wife Kerry. The comment was made, it's sort of Bondi Beach. It's better than Bondi Beach. A question here for Scott Morrison is, now he's travelling overseas, when can all other Australians also do that? And his answer was, basically, sit tight for now. It's up to the health professionals in Australia to make that decision, but now is not the time. They need more answers before doing that. And we are seeing here a rise in the number of cases of COVID-19 because of that Indian variant. Now, tomorrow he will also attend some more sessions here at the G7. There might be some more bilateral meetings that he attends as well, the Prime Minister, before he jets off to London. Now, London will be important too, of course, because the UK and Australia are still trying to negotiate that free trade agreement, but no deal has been done yet. And so really that's coming down to the wire. They might not get over the line before Scott Morrison leaves London midway through next week. And also, while he's in London, he'll jet off to Windsor for a meeting with the Queen.
And just more broadly, for the G7 nations, what will be dominating the meetings?
Well, of course, there'll be an official communique that comes out at the end of the summit, just after lunchtime tomorrow, local time. That was missing in the last couple of years under Donald Trump because the leaders couldn't reach agreement when Donald Trump was in the chair. They will reach some sort of agreement this time. Of course, the pandemic will dominate. It will be about distributing those billion extra doses of COVID-19 vaccines across the world into developing nations. That's going to be a big commitment that these leaders make. There'll be other commitments in there as well, of course, including potentially that call for a second independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. These leaders want a much better inquiry than we saw the first time around, which of course Australia called for. And if that is in the final communique, it will anger China, it will anger Beijing. So the leaders will really, I think they're the two main issues that will come out of this summit. But of course climate change too, that's a huge issue here. And Scott Morrison has really been under pressure from the UK and the US leaders to commit to that 2050 target of net zero emissions. But again, Scott Morrison today, during a doorstop that he had here in Cornwall, was not prepared to do that. He said Australia would do what is best for Australia, and he would not commit to that target at this stage.
And Cornwall, of course, not just hosting this very important G7 summit, there are protests there as well.
Well, there are, but it's very controlled, as you can imagine here. The security is incredibly tight. There's 5,000 police on the streets here. And so it is difficult for the protesters to get anywhere near. In fact, they cannot get anywhere near the leaders. But there has been protesters, of course, on a range of issues. But mainly, I think we've seen on climate change. That is a very big issue that these leaders are dealing with. Boris Johnson does, I think, want to make his mark at this summit to show that the leaders are taking action on climate change, particularly ahead of that really big summit in Glasgow later in the year in November. And again, the leaders have called on Scott Morrison to do more. So far, he has resisted that pressure to set that target, that 2050 target. He may set that before the November deadline for Glasgow, but he hasn't indicated that during this doorstop today.
All right, Samantha Hawley reporting from the G7 summit in Cornwall. Thank you.